come on in. Thank you. All right. Okay. I'm getting the thumbs up from Shatika, so that means, oh, no, not yet, almost. I will go when she tells me to go, and I'm a minute before. Thank you. Thank you, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Vanderbilt Divinity School. I want to welcome those of you who are streaming live, and to those of you who are here in the space, which is literally what we call this room, the space here at VDS. My name is Yolanda Pierce, and I'm honored to serve as the 17th Dean here at Vanderbilt Divinity School. This is the 2023 Harrod Lecture. The Howard L. Harrod Lecture was established to honor Dr. Harrod, who served as the Oberlin Alumni Professor of Social Ethics and Sociology of Religion, who taught for more than 30 years at Vanderbilt. Dr. Harrod worked extensively in environmental ethics and activism and was an advocate for new ways of understanding the relationship of humans with the natural and the animal worlds. Welcome a speaker tonight, Dr. Karilyn Crockett. She holds the PhD from the American Studies program at Yale University. I'm a Princeton alum, so I'll forgive her for that. A Master of Science in Geography from the London School of Economics, a Master of Arts and Religion from Yale Divinity School. Dr. Crockett served for 4 years with the Mayor's Office of Economic Development as the Director of Economic Policy and Research and the Director of Small Business Development for the City of Boston. She recently completed her service as the City of Boston's first Chief of Equity, a cabinet-level position that Mayor Walsh established to embed equity and racial justice into all city planning operations and work history and work moving forward. She holds a faculty appointment as Professor of Urban History, Public Policy, and Planning in MIT's Department of Urban Studies and Planning. Her academic work, her research focuses on large-scale land use changes in 20th century American cities, and it examines the social and geographic implications of structural poverty and racial formations. Dr. Crockett's book, People Before Highways, Boston Activists, Urban Planners, and a New Movement for City Making, investigates a 1960s-era grassroots movement to halt urban extension of the U.S. interstate highway system and the geographic and political changes in Boston that resulted. Her 2019 book was named one of the 10 best books of the decade by the Boston Public Library Association of Librarians. We are delighted to welcome Dr. Crockett here to VDS tonight for a lecture she has titled Crossing Highways, Byways, and Mountains, A Quest to Recover Sacred Visions. Following this reception and hopefully a little bit of conversation, you are welcome, if you are here in the building with us, to join us for a reception. It is my honor and delight to welcome Dr. Crockett.
Thank you, Dean Pierce. It is so wonderful to be here tonight and to really have a chance to be in community. I have never been to Nashville, and my only regret is that I'm here so short. I have to come back and spend some more time with you. So thank you for the opportunity to be here and for such a warm welcome. I am honored to be able to address you for the Harrod Lecture for 2023. This lecture would not be possible or even plausible without the might, power, and grace of my intellectual North Star, Dr. Emily Towns, a forever dean for real. Dr. Towns was my advisor at Yale Divinity School And she was that one grad school professor who nudged, "How about a PhD?" And nudged again, "How about a PhD?" And I was the classic, aggravated, agitated, and unconvinced grad student who felt like 2 years in a master's program already felt like too many years away from adulthood and things that really mattered. I have never been more grateful to be totally wrong. As you all well know, Dr. Towns has that knack for asking why, as all good ethicists must. But she also secretly, if not so secretly, packs that sage womanist gem which demands, "So what are we going to do about it?" Dr. Towns, thank you. She's not here, but it's really to thank her for encouraging me and pushing me and helping me understand the meaning of call. So though I don't work in a faith-based institution, I am in the world with all of us and understand the importance of mission and call. I stand here representing the 5th generation of literacy in my family. This is significant and always deserves mentioning because it puts into context the achievement of my family and families like mine for whom literacy was a crime. My family was enslaved in South Carolina, which amended its Negro Act of 1739 to criminalize reading and writing for enslaved people. The 1740 Comprehensive Negro Act would go on to ban slaves from being able to grow their own food, assemble in groups, earn their own money, as well as learn to read. So to stand before you tonight, not only in defiance of that heinous and immoral act, but as the fulfillment of my family's most audacious and revolutionary dreams nearly 200 years later, is not insignificant. My title of MIT professor is an achievement for us and a historic moral clapback that I take seriously. I share this with you because we are all, after all, a people of faith, a people who believe in the necessity of transgression and transformation at the highest levels of human and divine witness. Thank you for having me here tonight and welcoming me into this loving community of prophecy and light. Thank you so much. My talk is entitled Crossing Highways, Byways, and Mountains, A Quest to Recover Sacred Vision, and it draws on some experiences and adventures I've had since my time in divinity school, which feels like a very long time ago. As a scholar of the built environment and the social worlds produced by it, I believe the question of what are we going to do about the challenges, injustices, and horrors of the world we inherit is the single most important question of our lives. This is the question our lives must strive to answer fully, completely, and with love overflowing always. My work tracks the plans, strategies, intentions, and dreams of activists, sometimes politicians, workers, and everyday people who have really based their lives on the U.S. promise of freedom and shared prosperity. This is a seemingly timeless quest, yet there is nothing more modern than the desire to have a home in a world that is constantly stripping and threatening to displace you from the one you're in. And there is nothing more sacred, in my view, than seeking out and supporting the dreams of communities that resist erasure, coloniality, and domination then and now. These communities lift up sacred visions and promise something far greater than what governments or markets alone can ever bring us. May we learn from them. May we honor them always. Earlier this morning, we laid to rest my dear Uncle Harry. So I dedicate this talk to him and his love of light yeast rolls, his love of gardens in bloom, and children running everywhere, and barbecue, and barbecue, and barbecue. My family arrived in Boston in the 1950s from Excelsior, West Virginia, in search of economic promise and opportunity. They arrived just as the city was twisting and turning in the midst of massive economic, political, and racial change. Much of this change benefited suburban white communities, not black migrants from West Virginia. And the city itself turned into a battleground of protests, of demands from bankers, from suburbanites, from folks who were really looking for something quite different from a city that was in distress. In the 1950s, when my family began to make their movement here, you see on your left is my great-grandfather, Henry Garnell Young, and my great-grandmother next to him, Mary Emma Young. They are the North Stars for us. They are the folks that made the dream of something else possible and necessary. But this was what Boston was planning for itself in 1948. You're looking here at the center of Boston. For those of you that may have been there, know that you're looking eastward into downtown. You begin to see some tall buildings in the distance. And you're in the heart of a community, a working community, an African-American community, a multi-ethnic community right there to the east, which is the South End. And so in 1948, highway planners came up with this idea of a 10 to 12 lane highway that would go right through the middle of the city. You see it looping, snaking, and really bringing what would have been 180,000 cars into the heart of Boston. This was a dream, fortunately for many of us, a dream that was refused and denied and never materialized, but this was the vision. What's always amazing to me about these kinds of maps, for those of you that are familiar, whenever highway planners draw highways, you notice that there's never any traffic, right? As soon as these things are drawn or dreamed, they are a utopian vision of what car travel could be. And so what we do know, actually, that when these counts were made, when these drawings were produced in 1948 and then in 1950 and 60, many of the counts were already outmoded. And so the idea that you'd be able to zip from one part of Boston to zip around this bend over into Cambridge was nothing but a pipe dream. And so, but this was the dream for the city. This was progress. This was the future. This was a part of the federal interstate system that was envisioned early in the 20th century and then made possible when President Eisenhower signed off on the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956. And so many of you have seen this map, originally called the sort of Defense Act, the defense roads, but really what the roads were about was really reconnecting so much of the country's cities and towns to create an economic whole was the vision, and also a political whole. And so you have here before you 41,000 miles going all across the country in every imaginable direction. And representing more than $500 billion today of infrastructure investment. And this plan and this dream for what cities could be and what the United States would be after the Second World War was celebrated. For many folks, you can see here, this is Wisconsin, Interstate 94, a genderized welcoming by Miss Concrete and Miss Asphalt, Miss Blacktop, really celebrating, again, what a highway would mean. It meant the future, it meant progress, it meant prosperity, most often for downtown bankers, for politicians who were really trying to imagine what the new could be. And for folks that were trying to get out of their suburban homes into town to work, to shop, this was the new vision of what America could look like. And for those of us on the East Coast, I-95 is what tells that story. So we know I-95 is a continuous road that goes from Maine all the way up there, Bangor, all the way down to Miami. In a pretty much continuous thread that goes for 1,900 miles. What's significant about the arrival of I-95 was that it also brought a significant amount of protest and devastation for communities that were not benefiting from car travel, but were in cities where roads were passing through their neighborhoods and communities. And so for us, the story of I-95's arrival also signals absolute protest and absolute resistance on the part of communities that were the target of these kinds of roads. In Boston, by about 1966, most of the development for I-95 was coming all the way up through the south, except for the last 10 miles. And so inside of the city of Boston, here again, we are also looking east. You can barely see it, but up on your right at the top, there's a shadow of a building, which would be the Prudential Life Insurance business, which was the first kind of new development or skyscraper that comes into Boston's skyline in the post-war period. And it is really a signal of this new kind of economy. So the arrival of the interstate highway system is also signaling a new kind of economic restructuring, bringing us toward an economy that will be based in finance, insurance, and real estate. This is the beginning of that moment. But it starts with this kind of clearance. And so you're in the middle of a very densely populated part of the city, but you wouldn't know it. And so this woman who's walking her dog, who's looking over her shoulder very suspiciously, she's probably looking back at the Globe, the Boston Globe photographer that's taking this picture. And it's giving a real sense of the communities who are in the middle of the city, who are waiting for the arrival of this highway, but really skeptical about what would happen. More clearance, more devastation, as you can see rendered there. And so what's significant for me to offer to you to think about is the ways that not only does President Eisenhower featured here, signing off on some really important legislation, the Federal Aid Highway Act signed off in 1956, which is the act that formalizes the interstate highway system and actually makes the funding available. There had been many plans, many desires to have interstate highway plans go through cities, but there had not been money. On this day, Eisenhower makes that possible. What's significant, and I offer to you, is also to consider Brown versus the Board of Education and how important that decision was just a little bit before. And there could not be two decisions or two sets of laws more opposite. And so you have the federal highway system, which is trying to create a way of connecting the entire country economically, geographically, but was actually cutting through many communities that are actually resegregating racially and economically very significant parts of the country. You have the Brown decision of May 1954, actually sets the high water mark for signaling the forward movement toward racial integration. For many folks who were involved in the civil rights movement, they would take the Brown decision as a clear and strong affirmation of their desire to bring racial integration to the country, first in schools and then through private accommodations, markets, etc. So what I would like for us to think about is what does it mean to consider these two laws, a decision, a legislative act that is actually defining and determining a very different, in fact, opposite future for how the country would be spatially, physically, and racially organized. And so when we think about how people are imagining the road systems, again, in Boston, I have in front of you a map of the desire lines of travel. And some of you may be familiar with this transportation term, desire line. Hopefully you're spared of that. You're not in a planning department like me where you have to think about all these technical, weird words and ideas. A desire line is basically a term that lays out where you want to go. And so for a transportation planner, you would create a destination plan by talking to people at gas stations on the side of the road, stopping them at various places and asking them, where would you like to go? You're here, and people would say, I want to go here, I want to go there. And so all of these lines that you see are aggregated data from destination surveys that planners have had with different motorists. And so this is how this shape, which is called a spoke and hub. You see this radial pattern. It's the product of surveys conducted with people trying to figure out that shape. Well, these lines would become a really important, not only design, but a battleground for folks who were in Boston who, in the end, would really protest and rally around these dotted lines that you see. So the dotted lines are the state planners' suggestions of where this interstate road would go. And so on your I guess that's your left side. You see the dotted lines going up to the northeast and down to the Southwest Expressway. That's showing you the extension of I-95 and what the plan would be to bring that road, the 10 miles that remained, up through the city and up through the cities and then north up through Lynn and Saugus. That radial loop called an inner belt was very significant because it was going through several neighborhoods, including Somerville, Cambridge, and Brookline, and would become the way that folks on the ground would organize and start to resist the idea of this highway. Here on this map is significant because you're looking at in the middle of the Charles River. Many of you who've been to Boston or know our geography know that the Charles River is what separates Boston from Cambridge. And these two cities had very different strategies for how they wanted to attack these roads and these dotted lines, which again, in the end, were defeated. So for us here, what we're looking at is a 1966 moment of the city of Boston, Greater Boston, and Cambridge, imagining what its modern future would be. You had the support of the president, President Eisenhower. You had the support of the governor, then Governor Volpe, later Governor Sargent. You had the support of many mayors, with the exception of Cambridge, which held the veto. And so here, you have basically a consensus, except for people who were living beneath all of these lines and in the neighborhoods and in public housing developments like the Whittier housing, Lenox Camden, South End, other places where people were saying, no, we want to stay in the city. We don't even have a car. We're not interested in these roads, and we want to fight back, and fight back is what they began to do. And so here you have folks in Cambridge beginning to think about what the new alignment of the road could be. It's a little bit difficult to read the map. It's pretty sort of a basic street level map, but what you can see is MIT's campus footprint in the bottom of the map. You see three maps that are essentially the same, but what's significant for us to look at is the hashtag lines at the top that's showing what the state's proposed route for this highway would be, the part of it that would slice through Cambridge. And then you have the green line and the blue line showing what residents in those neighborhoods were proposing as options to shift the road. So this movement that began by people sort of talking about where this road could be began not as an anti-highway movement, but sort of as a highway movement. And so you see people beginning to suggest a different kind of alignment, but a movement in 1965 starting to get its feet. And on the Boston side of this, you have a very different approach. So we had a set of folks, including Chuck Turner, who you see there on this side, who was friends with Stokely Carmichael, later Kwame Ture, who some of you may know from Stokely's involvement and leadership of the Students for the Student Nonviolent for Coordinated Action. SNCC, so important for really pushing a new generation's vision of what on-the-ground mobilization could be. And the relationship between Chuck Turner, who was a local activist, who was someone who had been involved in the Northern Student Movement, had written for a Hartford newspaper, had come to Boston to go to Harvard, was politicized by his involvement in the Northern Student Movement, and his relationship with Stokely would push them to think about not only civil rights, but also what that meant in space, what that meant in the context of, in fact, this highway movement. This is from an interview that I had done with Chuck, where he's recounting his involvement with his relationship with Stokely Carmichael, and the fact that Stokely warns Chuck and others that they had been doing some organizing in Selma, and that they had found out that there was going to be a government, basically an investigation, a shutdown, a crackdown on activists who were moving and were doing black nationalist activism, civil rights activism, and saying that people need to come together and form what he called united fronts. And so in Boston, there was a Black United Front that was formed that was bringing together very, very, very different factions of civil rights organizers, folks who were much more radical, nationalists, or even Marxists, and folks who were much more moderate, even on the NAACP and the Urban League side. And so this group, the Black United Front, started to meet as an underground organization soon after 65. And then in 68, that group, which was an underground organization, began to think differently about what its politics could be. And then with the assassination of Dr. King, the Black United Front became an above-ground organization, and so announces itself just a few days after Dr. King's assassination. His assassination, as we know, was April 4th, 1968. These 21 demands are released by the Black United Front on April 8th, 1968. And one of the demands, number 19, is demanding that the Inner Belt and the Southeast Expressway be halted immediately. This is significant for us because in terms of thinking about civil rights protests and organizing at this period, you're seeing a newer, younger generation of activists who are much more concerned about a material reality of the community than a high watermark of civil disobedience, nonviolent civil disobedience, or even a racial integration. And so this movement starts to really foment and takes its expression in this slogan here, Stop I-95, People Before Highways, which was the way that the movement, People Before Highways, which was the way that the movement named itself, claiming space through its not only direct actions, but also through markings like this on spaces that were the alignment for where the highway would be. And so this movement, this coalition, this kind of coming together of, again, civil rights activism, a new generation of activists trying to come to terms with Dr. King's assassination. Here you see a group of folks standing in vigil on the other side of Dr. King's assassination with this new kind of sign. That seems quite simple, but was still quite radical in this moment of 1968. The articulation of black is beautiful. The word black, not colored, not Negro, meaning not just a racial identity, but a new kind of political identity, and staking that claim right in front of the Massachusetts State House, which is where folks were. Just a few months later, you would have people congregating again in front of the Massachusetts State House, which you can sort of dimly see there, standing to protest highways. And so the anti-highway movement would come into fullness just about 9 months after this demonstration in memorial to Dr. King. And what we have is a cross-fertilization of movements, of ideas, of thoughts about what does it mean to come into a post-civil rights moment. What does it mean for younger activists who are making new kinds of claims on the state? And so a lot of this would fuel and inspire what would become this incredibly large, multiracial, regional movement that would find itself again and again on the front steps of the State House. This is from People Before Highways Day, which folks named it that. On January 25th, 1969, where about 2,000 people showed up on the steps of the State House to tell the new governor, Francis Sargent, that they did not want these roads to exist, to go forward. You can see some of the different signs. You can see the diversity of ages, of races, of groups. If you know anything more about Boston's regional geography and identity, you could even point out sort of Cambridge left people, suburban moms from Belmont. They're all there. And so the story for us is wondering, how do you get from 1955, envisioning of what the road could be, borrowing from 1948, to this moment in 1969, where you have a very, very intense, regional, mature protest fomenting, happening, demanding not only new kinds of policy, but new kinds of political representation and investment. And as this is happening, and as people are trying to push the governor's hand, push the governor who had been pro-highway to say no, people are trying to figure out what to do with land that is laying dormant, that it's been cleared, that is waiting for the highway's arrival. So this is from a little bit later, I think it's from this is later, even 1981, but where the people created this thing called the Southwest Corridor Farm. It's taking its name from the road itself, the Southwest Corridor. You can see how we're looking again eastward into the city. Right behind there is the community of Roxbury, which is a largely African-American community at that time. Here you're on land which is in Jamaica Plain, which is another multi-ethnic or multiracial, large Latinx community that's here. People are trying to figure out what to grow. And so this is Carmenza Funstad, who is leading a horticulture class where residents are thinking about the kinds of greens and seeds and other things that they might grow and how to make the land work for them. It's notable if you see those telephone poles, this is another indication that this was a residential community. You can imagine the wiring and all the infrastructure that is needed to support homes is some of what you see, even though there are no homes here. So the clearance for the highway is evident, but what is even more important is the community's articulation of how to make the land usable for them, how to reinterpret highest and best use of land, which is a planning and a transportation sort of shorthand for how do you think about how land should be used. The community is saying the land should be used for food, not for cars and not for highways. Similarly, the Black Panthers, led by Floyd Hardwick, who was the chief, the captain of education for the Boston chapter of the Black Panthers. They take land, they put this white trailer on land that had been cleared for the highway, showing again that community residents and even Black nationalists are saying the land that we have here is not needed for cars or for a highway, but for a health center. And so using their relationships with people at Harvard Medical School to get supplies and to get support, they were able to run a free health center, which was really capitalizing on the fact that the community was in need of more care, more health care in this instance, and making that available on a more regular basis. And so all of these strategies for residents, for activists to say at this time, what we need is access to health care. What we need is food. What we need is not a car-based fossil fuel future. We need much more immediate things. And over time, they were able to actually convince the governor to say, we were wrong. There's an incredible sort of set of meetings, conversations, reports that were generated that convinced Governor Sargent that what was needed was multimodal transportation. What was needed was a much more inclusive and radical idea about how to make the city useful for people who actually live there, but it was not without his hand being forced over many years by many of the people that you see. So this is a little bit of a cloud of witnesses here. Some of the people who were in that original demonstration that I showed you from 1969. We have so many people, including Gloria Fox, who was a mother in one of the public housing developments who became politicized because when the land was vacant, much of the dust that was sitting became it lodged in her son's lungs, and many of the children in the community where she was started to have respiratory issues because of vacant land. And when she saw that, she realized that there was an environmental implication immediately for her and her community and wanted to get engaged. And so there are many others, from Ann Hirschfang, who would become engaged because of the desire to protect her home and her community in the South End. She would go on to become the the Deputy Secretary of Transportation for the state, Chuck Turner, that you know, his relationship with Stokely Carmichael. Byron Rushing is there, Fred Salvucci, many people who at the ground level were very much politicized by what this movement meant, and were very fundamental to laying out the future. Up there is Mildred Haley, who was someone who became engaged in this question around housing for people. During this period, the city is experiencing a housing crisis in 1960, and she really pushed on her neighbors and pushed on the governor to understand what we had was not a transportation crisis needing cars, but a housing crisis representing an opportunity to engage tenants in the right to lead themselves, which she did with leadership at Bromley Heath, which is a public housing development, and others. And so many people saying there's something more, there's something needed, this land can be repurposed for all of these new ways, all of these new designs. And so at the end, much of the land that was carved up and cleared for highways would be redesigned as a 4.7-mile linear park. This is just bits of it showing you that there's new mass transit and transit stations, there's new public art, there's outdoor parks, bike paths, there's community gardens. I would invite all of you to come to the city and see this miraculous tribute to the power of grassroots citizen organizing and also visioning for what a city can be at a time where a city is in the midst of change and transformation. And so much of this is just kind of bringing you up to date a little bit, showing you what the alignment, which is what this map is showing, the alignment of what the road would have been. Vacant parcels that were actually set aside for future development, that's yellow. The green is showing you land that was used to create parks. So these were surplus lands that had been cleared and set aside, and a lot of that green, the green parcels are showing you what became this linear park that I was speaking of. And yet there are still parcels that are right there in the middle of the city today, right now, 2023, that are empty and need to be developed. And so when I was in city government, we spent a lot of time thinking about how these lands could be repurposed. And then I talked to a lot of the folks who lived around and in the community and talked to them about what did they imagine that they would want this land to be used for. And the overwhelming cry is not for a highway ever again. So how could we build new kinds of residential uses, commercial uses, even educational uses that would make sure that the land could never fall prey to a highways plan or scheme. And so at the same time, this is in the 1970s moment, this 1960s and 70s moment is when my own family is starting to get its footing in the city of Boston. And so in this image, you have my grandmother, who's right in the middle, who raised me, and next to her is her mom. They have on their Sunday best. I'm pretty sure they're coming from church or going to church. Next there in the corner is my Uncle Henry, who is her oldest brother, who is our pastor and runs our family church. And this is our family's Garden of Prayer, Church of God in Christ, our storefront church, which still exists in the heart of the city. And so as my family is making its way, I've become very curious to know how are they managing in the midst of so much change and turmoil. This is my grandmother's ledger book that is showing some of the payments that she's making as the first person in our family, the first woman in our family who was able to buy property in the city of Boston. And so these entries are showing you all of the payments that she's making toward the acquisition of this home in 1969, a really crucial moment. As I mentioned to you, in 1969 is really the high point of the anti-highway movement, and yet there's still folks who are trying to get footing here. And so some of these numbers are kind of astonishing when you look at how modest they are. Some of her moving costs, $125, that seems okay. She buys a dining room set here for $44 from the Salvation Army. I'm sure it was, I don't know what it was, but it was something. And so you see a very sort of careful homemaking, a very careful nesting, desiring to have an asset, a footing in the industrial north at a time of tremendous change. This is probably the most valuable possession that I have, which is my grandmother's notebook. It's her high school notebook from her senior year, 1955 at Excelsior High School in West Virginia. And when I look inside this book to try to see what she was doing, I see all of the things that they were reading. They were reading Silas Mariner. They were reading A Midsummer's Night Dream. They were reading Shakespeare. They were reading all of these things in this very tiny town in West Virginia, actually in the coal mines. And so there is this person who's had an incredibly strong education, an incredibly rich foundation in the Western canon. Here's her drawing from oh my gosh, yes, the Mariner here. She says, alone, alone, all alone, alone, alone on a wide, wide sea. And of course, this is sort of speaking to us from all the things that you learn in high school. These stories, these conceptions, these reflections on a story. My grandmother was a great reader, someone who was incredibly well-educated, and someone who, when she came to Boston, found herself actually disappointed and devastated with the quality of education that her children were receiving in the school system in the 1960s, and winds up actually suing the Boston School Committee. And she's as a named plaintiff in the suit that led to what would be the busing story in Boston. So many of you know this actually tragic and terrible story of desegregation in Boston that we are still recovering from. But in this particular moment, in 1972, my grandmother, who is just, again, getting her own footing in the city, calls out very specifically to the desire and the dream and the vision for something better, something more. In the document here, which is the basically cover of the civil suit, she's named. My mother is named. All of her children are named. These are all the mothers that got together, mostly black mothers, and their children who were demanding that the school move toward racial integration and move toward a higher call and a higher standard for what education should be in the city of Boston for all children. And so she would have no idea, I'm sure, that this would be some of the results. So some of this is pulling on what we know to be the 1976, of course, Pulitzer Prize winning photo that shows Ted Landsmark, who's actually a dear friend, who was attacked by some white youth who were meeting, rallying angrily on City Hall Plaza. He's going to his meeting. Ted wasn't even involved. There's a briefcase of his, and they grab him. And then the picture is taken, and it goes into history. And so all of these events are telling a very particular story of Boston in a very particular moment of the 1970s. Even though we could talk about the 60s and what happened, for me it's interesting to think about the relationship between the North and the South and people like my family who are traveling between the two. And so my grandmother would have had no idea that that would be the result of her civil action, of her suit, since what she had experienced in 1965 was a Big Creek High School, which was, this high school in where they were in West Virginia. This was the school that they would go to in the following year when my grandmother and her sisters and brothers would actually integrate this school in 1966, peacefully so. There were no rocks. There were no flags being attacked on people. There was nothing except bad yearbook pictures for everyone in the fall of 1966. And so the story of how it is that Big Creek managed to take 140 black students from the high school that my grandmother and her sisters and brothers went to integrate this school is a cautionary tale in terms of how we stereotype or even romanticize what racial integration looks like in the North versus the South. And so I decided that I wanted to go and see this place called West Virginia myself, since there were so many stories. And so I went there this summer for the first time. This is called the Mountain State for a reason. And so these are some of the images that I'm just snapping in the car. And I was astonished to go to this place West Virginia that are so formative for how my family thinks about their politics in the North, for how they think about economic possibility, for how they think about race, for how they think about politics, for how they think about all of these things. And so the stories of the landscape and the topography is striking all by itself. So much of a strong and industrial character to this landscape of West Virginia. Is anyone from West Virginia? Has anyone been there? You've been there, you're not from, yeah, okay, y'all know it. Well, good for you, because this was all new to me. And so my family is from a town called War, or the city is called War, which has its distinction here as being supposedly the only place in the United States actually called War, maybe that's what they say, and also in West Virginia, the southernmost city. Very well known for an incredible coal mining tradition, since my family were coal miners in McDowell County. Some of you may know the history of McDowell County. Its claim to fame is producing the best coal, bituminous coal, the hottest coal, the greatest number of BTUs, very valuable community that's there. And this is the bottom of that road you're looking at. In Excelsior, that's showing where my family had lived before coming to Boston in the 50s. It was striking to us that in going down there, my aunt came with me, that we couldn't actually get to where they were. The community is now the site of a waste sewage facility. And so this fence is sort of showing you some of the land that's blocked off and being pulled into this facility, but it's showing how I have no family members there anymore, and even the remnants of where they were, some of the physicality of their homes, all of that is a ruin, essentially. And so it became really difficult to actually get a sense of what's there. I think there was some video that's trying to be there. Let's see if we can see. Might not be. That's okay. And so this quest for me was to try to understand a little bit more about my grandmother's story, but also my great-grandfather's story, Henry Garnell, who was in fact himself a coal miner and was one of 6,000 coal miners in McDowell County. This guy is interesting because he was really involved in his church and his community. He was a deacon, was the director of the choir, director of the Sunday school, and had a big commitment to a big family. My grandmother's one of 12 children. Her father's vision and commitment to education for them was really important, but he also had this vision around what it means to bring people together, literally his family, and literally in this very, very tiny place where they were. And my grandmother captured some of it, and she captured even this church that they had, Rosebud Baptist Church, which was built by my great-grandfather. And so when I went to West Virginia this summer, one of the things I was hoping to find was some remnant of this church, based on this drawing and based on the fact that it was destroyed, as she writes here, by a fire in 1946. But it was rebuilt. And so the idea that this could be somewhere in the area, I don't even know how you find a church. You look at a lot of pictures of churches and you try to match them like I did. And then I found out that churches had some of these dual purposes. Sometimes people were worshiping in these places, but they were also used as union halls in this Pocahontas field, which is where my great-grandfather and others had worked. And so there were these songs and chants that people had in the community. And so I wonder what is it that would force people to leave this kind of community? Was there economic changes? Were there racial changes? Were there political changes? And then how much of that is traveling to other places? And so we get in this car, we drive around. This is my Aunt Alice, who comes with me, and she says she remembers going through the door that you see in the church and dyeing these Easter eggs for children's hunts, and that she starts to sort of invoke all these different memories that she has. And then we see this image in a hillside, abandoned, which is the church itself. And so I have not had a chance to approach or to go inside. but this is the church, the Rosebud Baptist Church, now on a hillside, abandoned, overgrown. I don't know how stable it is, but I do know that because of some of the organizing in that community, that it was a religious center, but it also had these political roots to it as well. And so for a community that is completely desolated, there's no one there, definitely no one from our family, and there's no black community in this town. The question is, what can this building tell us? How could it be used? Could it be stabilized? Could it be shipped? It's a bunch of different questions that I actually have right now thinking about it, and have started to go through some newspapers and things to understand the history of the building. And so this is a newspaper from 1941 that talks about the people meeting in Excelsior, and there's a group called the Homemakers Association of Women who meet at Rosebud Baptist Church, and they have a conversation about what they want to do. They have a speaker, and they have a delicious chicken dinner, which is great, which says there. So I know that this building was important to the community and civic life, and I'm really struck by the fact that actually a structure that was built by people who were coal miners who had very, very limited means and money, but they pooled their money to make this institution that very much spoke to the vision of community that they had for themselves. And so there's something for me that's dynamic about thinking through what we saw in terms of people making space, making community, creating different kinds of structures, even on the land that was cleared for the highway in a later period. And similarly with this church that is sort of calling in a way, but is speaking it stands as a kind of memorial, a kind of beacon for the kind of communities that people imagined and how they wanted them to function, even with limited means. And so for someone who teaches in a planning department, it is really important to understand these kinds of anti-planning, planning interventions where communities are articulating their own kind of vision, their own ideas about what they want and what they need, pooling their resources, pooling their sense of purpose and mission to make these things appear, to make them real in very difficult conditions that can be physical conditions, that can be very difficult social, racial, and economic conditions, which was certainly the case here in Excelsior, West Virginia, and certainly the case in Boston, Massachusetts. And so what is it that these kind of alternate plans can tell us and can signal? And so this is a picture of my my aunts and uncles as adult people. And my grandmother, who's in the back there, you can see next to her is this drawing that she's made of their town. It's kind of hard to see, but she's trying to show to everyone, very proudly so, what their community in these mountains looked like and how they brought so much of that with them to Boston to actually make a new kind of vision and hope for subsequent generations in our family, including me. In the middle here is my Uncle Harry there, in the light blue that we laid to rest today. And so incredible to think through the migration stories, but how important it is to stand with folks who have different kinds of visions for not only where they live and how they live, but what is true for all of us. I feel really strongly that these kinds of stories of movement, stories of resistance, whether you're organizing and in the situation where folks were rallying against the highway, or even some of my great-grandfather's earlier organizing in the 1930s, where he was organizing in Excelsior to create a multiracial, actually an interracial union, which was nearly unheard of in 1933. But it really challenges how we think about what's possible when and where. And so here is essentially an invitation for us to resituate ourselves even in relationship to our own family histories, and to think about how people signal not only what they need, but what is possible. And how is it that we can use the various skills and talents and abilities that we have to be in solidarity with folks who can actually really benefit from the specialized training, which is sometimes listening, and holding space for new kinds of visions and quests. And so really appreciate the opportunity to think about new directions in terms of my own scholarship and share that with you a little bit tonight. So thank you so much. sure.
If you We'd love to just give you all an opportunity to ask questions, engage the speaker. I'm full. This was rich, right? I'm over here like, okay, wait, no, here. I mean, I'm really, really full. And then she started talking about Kojic, and I was like, oh, well, yes, my people everywhere. But questions or comments that you'd like to engage with our speaker. Dean Armour.
Thank you so much for this talk. This has been really, really rich, and it resonates with me in a couple of different ways, and I'll just talk about one at the moment. I'll save West Virginia for another conversation.
Please.
So I did my graduate work here, and then I came back in 2006 as a professor, and in between I lived in Memphis. And I'm not sure if you know the story of Memphis, but there's a kind of similar story to the one that happened in Boston of resistance to I-40 going straight through Memphis and going through Overton Park. Now, the piece I'm not sure about is exactly, because it was women who led it, but I have the sense that it was more white women than it was a really multiracial coalition, but you might know. Okay. But at the same time, it had an impact because I-40 now ends. And it's still, to get to I-40, you have to go around the whole city, And it ends in Binghamton, which is a predominantly black neighborhood. So it actually did, whether it was intentional or not, save a black neighborhood. And I think it also had some effect on, I laugh at, we talk about Midtown in Nashville. Ain't no such thing. Memphis has real Midtown. And Midtown is a very multiracial area, a very multiracial neighborhood in Memphis, which doesn't mean it's, all integrated from street, house to house, but it at least is kind of definitely a multiracial neighborhood. And I'm also not putting Memphis forward as this utopia, because it's certainly got lots of issues and lots of problems. But I'm just wondering, it makes me wonder if there are other cities besides Boston and Memphis that are where you have these kinds of examples of activism that really did end up reshaping, preventing the reshaping of a city.
Sure.
And in the process, reshaping a city in a different way, and particularly one that is as multiracial as the one that you described.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, thank you for the question. And Boston was really late to this kind of fight. I think it's really the story of San Francisco and the Embarcadero is like the first kind of highway revolt, and there are many of these that happen. And so definitely not the first story here, and definitely not the only place that had a victory. And so, but your question is interesting to make me wonder what are places that did wind up preserving a multiracial or even communities of color, since that's typically is not the story. And so we can look at New Orleans in particular and look about what happened in terms of folks trying to save the French Quarter versus the decimation of the Treme with the 10. And so you have cities where you can have a sort of a bifurcated story like that too. So, but I wonder what it would mean to actually look at some of those highway revolts in terms of communities that were spared, since typically that's not the case. And a lot of that has to do with there's clear racial overlay for sure, but it also has to do the way that state highway planners, when they're trying to figure out highway takings, typically you are prioritizing land of the least value, the least real estate value. And we know that in that country that correlates racially and otherwise. And so that's part of the calculus, and then it tells a story of the devastation that we see. Yeah, thank you for your question, though.
Thank you. My question is more centered in our contemporary struggles against developers who are now going into these low-value areas, neighborhoods, quote-unquote low-value areas and neighborhoods, and are developing and gentrifying these neighborhoods and pushing people out. That's an issue that's really central to what's happening here in Nashville. Yeah. And so I'm wondering if there are any sort of threads of commonality that you've been able to trace along the richness of the lecture that you presented today, and of course the other capacities in which you have had the opportunity to serve, about how communally we can formulate sacred vision into this kind of mode of resistance, and being able to have a say in how land is developed, and whose land is developed, and in what ways that land is developed, and who that land development serves. And so how we sort of maybe formulate that kind of sacred vision until the time that we can get parks or different sorts of things. If there are any like threads that you have been able to trace of commonality as far as tactics or mechanics.
Yep. Thank you for the question. The first thing is to try to know the history a little bit, and know the land history kind of any area, which is a real struggle, because I teach urban history, obviously, in a planning department. And for planners, a lot of their engagement with history is going to be however a city kind of tells its history, like whatever is on the front of the City Hall website or something. And I'm always sort of pushing students and colleagues to go deeper into the power relationships in a community between their land and where they are in government or whomever else. And so the first plea is always going to be to try to figure out how can you get an understanding of what the grassroots organizing history or the history of resistance on that landscape or for that community has been. And it may not just be localized. It may be a migration story, kind of like what some of the stories that I shared are signaling. There's a movement. So one is on the history. The second piece is we are in a very strange moment in that many of the stories that I was sort of talking about today around highway expansion, is certainly urban renewal stories that we can all talk about from the 1950s, are a very particular moment where the federal government is making a sort of massive set of investments in cities. And so we are not seeing that today. What we are seeing is a massive private investment. Some of it is transnational or global investment in dollars coming into cities to redevelop them. And so your question about how do you protect the process, or how do you think about the public involvement, is even more fraught today, because so many of these processes and some of these capital flows are private, which was not the case in the same way before. So a key question has got to be who are the politicians, or who are the electeds that are in these conversations, that are stewarding some of these questions that you're raising around process, around participation, around accountability, because that still is the lever that local and even state government can give, which is the accountability piece. But without the history and without kind of coalition politics, I really worry, and I don't know how we get that kind of accountability and protection of sacred vision that you mentioned, which is so important. But it's still there, right? You just have to sort of dig for it. And I also am a person who believes in trying to read the landscape. Can you look at the landscape for clues of previous plans or strategies? I teach a course called Undead Geographies that is about trying to develop skills to read the physical sort of makeup in a city, and not just in an architectural sense around styles, but how do you understand evidence of these kinds of struggles or battles or articulations of multiple visions sometimes that are competing, that you can actually see expressed in physical form. So happy to talk to you about that too. And can you tell me a little bit more about your own work or your own kind of involvement there?
Yeah, my research areas are not necessarily pertaining to this, but the interest that I have stems out of what I have witnessed in my very short time in Nashville. But I think it's a story that we all hear in different iterations, but there are huge amounts of privatized development going on, and particularly in the North Nashville area, which is not 10-minute drive from here, and how folks who have lived in those areas, who have called those areas home for generations, after the tornado and the flood kind of hit Nashville, and a lot of folks didn't have maybe the capital to rebuild their homes. Those lands were bought up, and are now, being housed, multi-plot, $800,000, we call them tall and skinnies, that are pushing families
Yes.
out of, not just out of their neighborhoods, but out of the city proper.
Yep.
And so and a lot of their voices are lost in that conversation. And so I'm more so just thinking about really introspectively, but also socioeconomically,
Yes.
how how we generate these sort of conversations around the literacy for those that are being immediately impacted.
Yep.
Right, but then how do we gird them with the language to be able to negotiate with their representatives, to more or less have a say in the conversations that are being had.
That's right.
And so that's kind of where my interests are. Yeah.
Has there been any, or maybe other people know, has there been any collective ownership organizing here in Nashville, or even like in terms of communities having land that's owned collectively in like a land trust, or housing that's cooperative housing? Have there been any kind of shared ownership models here that you know of?
I would be glad to see if anyone else has any other insights on that. I don't personally have any insights on that wise. I think a lot of what I have seen is, again, as the city kind of had two catastrophic incidents back to back, between the tornado and the flood, that it kind of decimated a lot of residential land, and even some land that was used, like there was like an airport and things like that. But those lands were quickly like bought up and developed, as it were. Heavy on the air quotes there. But and so I don't know if there have been any sort of collective organizing or senses of ownership about the land, as much as people are kind of still trying to figure out what their options are. How can they exercise their agency?
Sure.
What sort of policies are we enacting or not enacting? What conversations are we not having? That's just allowing these sort of developments to so rapidly take up so much space, and by way displace others.
Exactly. Yeah. No, appreciate you. Thank you for the reflection. Yeah.
Thank you. You kind of answered a little bit of my question in your previous answer, but I'm thinking about how land has multiple histories, right? How this, I'm not from Boston, so the Southwest Quarter, I don't want to get it wrong.
Good, you got it.
How that's not like the first story of like possession or dispossession or resistance or community building, how like there's centuries, much longer histories of that, and yet how like our memories are short. And thinking about like this trove of an archive you have from your grandmother's papers and journals, but how it's paper, right? Like it doesn't last. And so how do you think about like artifacts when you're thinking about like this renewed kind of placemaking and resistance, so that it's not just every generation's like re-inhabiting of a land, which I don't like that language, but it's what I have.
Yeah. So I like your question so much. I think I do like it, but let me make sure I hear it. Let me hear the rest. And so you're asking how to think about material artifacts. Something I think about a lot: artifacts and archives. And as a researcher, I ask the question of how do we, sometimes the stories you're trying to tell about people who have been displaced or have been dispossessed, you're pulling those stories from scraps. So you see me sort of gesturing in that way. There's a scrap here. Eventually this will be a study, there'll be a footnote, but how do you pull there? And the politics of knowledge are very deep here for me, because sort of as a group of us, we talk about this, how many of the things that are essential to organizing or activist stories would be like a pamphlet, a flyer, a button, a shirt, an agenda. These things are formally classified as ephemera by the Library of Congress. And so that already tells you something that you're getting at, that there's something quite fleeting about this type of evidentiary classification that for me is really alarming. But it's also alarming because within the Library of Congress's classification system, ephemera sits at the very bottom of the food chain of knowledge. So you have like a book, you have like a primary source, you have all these things, and then way, way, way at the very bottom is ephemera, when in fact much of the scholarship that I am engaged in would not be possible without ephemera, without these types of things. And so part of me is sort of issuing a challenge and also sort of a sense of horror that these very precious kinds of documents, particularly for communities who are not often owning, who have been sort of pushed, or sort of migration stories, make it very difficult to talk about transience, which is not actually transience. It's actually kind of multiple witnessing across multiple locations. And so I think it's really important to try to think about the embodiment of knowledge through lived life, through a person's own sort of story. And as someone who comes to this work also from government, I can tell you that timeline is problematic too. A political cycle of 4 years, of 2 years, of 3 years is not enough time to even begin to understand a place. And so in a place like a city hall or a mayor's office, which is actually heaving with paper, but with such impoverished understanding, is really a cautionary tale there. So I think artifacts are really important. I take the landscape itself as a crucial artifact. I think about highways as artifacts and cultural objects as well. And so your choice of that word is really notable, because I think what it suggests to me is you can give the lens of a cultural historian or cultural analyst who understands that so much of our reality are artifacts of our own making. And once you give it that viewpoint, it allows you to be much more penetrating in terms of your analysis. Yeah, thank you.
Good. Okay. I'll take a point of privilege and ask a final question. I was really struck by your talking about the very peaceful integration that happened at the high school, at the most southernmost city in a southern state,
Yes.
Juxtaposed with clearly the violence of integration of a high school in a quote unquote progressive northern
Right,
city.
quote unquote.
And my question is what's at stake piece for us to maintain a sort of historical narrative where the violence takes place in the South, but the North is progressive, when in fact we have so much evidence about violence everywhere and peaceful integration everywhere as well. Like the what's at stake with us still kind of telling a narrative that seems to locate the resistance to integration in the South. No one in the South wanted this, and yet these examples of, I think you said 140 blacks. I mean, so not even a small number or one little family, but seemingly probably an entire high school integrating. That was done, that then gave your ancestor access to a classical education. I mean, so I saw the reading list, right? I was like, oh,
That's
this is
real,
impressive.
right.
Former English teacher,
Right.
this is incredibly impressive. So I'm just wondering about that narrative and what's at stake for us maintaining sort of these kind of binaries about that.
Dean Pierce, thank you so much for that question. I think, as someone who asks questions about racial formations, it demands understanding that our racial relationships and our racial identities don't exist as sort of static boxes, and that where you are, how you experience, who you are, where you are, varies. So that is a nuance, and it's so important to think about, because we think we know each other, or we think we know a place, and we clearly don't. And so I think the way that we understand race and racial relations in this country is such a third rail in terms of just how you understand it, how you talk about it, how you represent it, that it actually keeps us away from having a deeper understanding of the complexity, but also specificity by place. And I think this question about racial integration as an idea is so fraught, because it also doesn't allow us to understand a deeper story. For, as I was sharing with my family in Excelsior, West Virginia, there was a community that was nurtured, a Black community that was full of Black excellence, not in a romantic notion. It was difficult, but that there was a sense of strength that was there as a result of racial segregation. And so people do talk about the loss of those kinds of communities that are socially cohesive, economically cohesive, at the expense of racial integration. And so I think, and then when I think about Stokely Carmichael and SNCC and this younger generation of activists who are demanding something else, that are demanding not racial integration, but local control or different ways to be in charge of land or directing it, it is really makes us question our politics and our simplistic view of what those politics mean. And so I think I was really astonished by a lot of what I saw in traveling to West Virginia and seeing the full articulation of community in 1933 in such a way that was so far and sophisticated and advanced from a planning perspective, from a social perspective, than anything that I am experiencing in the city of Boston right now. So that sense that you are going, but I said, back to the future or to some other period that's supposedly in the past, but is pointing to a very different sense of truth. I'm wrestling with that. So I appreciate your question, because it makes I think it demands us all to kind of have more thought and more to say than just the quick, oh, it's this, it's this, it's that. Yeah, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing the deepness and the complexity of your work, and also for sharing your family story. I think all of us were deeply moved by the images, the pictures. She was an artist, your grandmother, and to see that is really, really powerful. So please join me in thanking Dr. Crockett for being here tonight. Thank you. And you all are welcome to come join us for a reception right outside. Thank you.